Good evening. Thank you, Tony. What you didn't say is that when you listed all those areas of interest and these influences, these discussions, those dialogues, you didn't mention what was the topic of many of those lectures that you gave yourself at the Architectural Association around, the late, actually no, probably that was, yes, the early 70s, a long time ago. I mean Boulez, Ledoux, and Lequeux. And who talked about ritual and sequences? It was Tony Vidler in lectures about a totally different period, but somehow establishing perhaps the grounds in which one could say that architecture is not built up of distinct and separated, discontinuous circumstances, but there are a few things that actually stay, and one of them, of course, is the idea of sequence. And so what I would like to do tonight is, in a sense, is not really talking about the work and show photographs of buildings, is rather talking about an exhibition. And the reason why I use the exhibition as a form of filter between us and the work is that any exhibition, as you know, implies a certain level of curatorship. As it happens, we had a wonderful, we're talking about the Centre Pompidou, we had a wonderful curator, Frédéric Miguerou. He had absolutely the most extraordinary talent of telling the architect, you do it yourself. And occasionally simply saying, hey, how's about trying to do this? The point is, when you're being asked to do an exhibition in architecture, you just don't start simply by saying, oh, I'm going to show my work. You also ask yourself, what is an architectural exhibition? You're not showing buildings, you're not showing drawing exactly in the same manner. You are really building up a strange type, I would say, of ritual, a sequence of a passage. And so you ask yourself, what were the precedents of important architectural exhibition? So, of course, you look at the 1932 international exhibition of, by Philip Johnson at these, one used to call, before MoMA was at MoMA, or other exhibition, Lily Reich and Mies, or other larger events, more recently, in the National Gallery in Berlin, a gigantic OMA exhibition, or here you can see an exhibition of Herzog and de Meuron on the top images, but below there is another one which is extremely interesting. It's not an architectural exhibition. It's an exhibition showing the work of a filmmaker, Stanley Kubrick. It's a big exhibition that was in LA a year ago or so. And what was fascinating, for me at least, was the fact that it was not an exhibition showing movies. It was an exhibition about filmmaking. It was about an exhibition of filmmaking. And it was incredibly powerful in the way it could go within the underlayers of what is cinema. And we looked at that exhibition quite carefully. I even sent someone who helped me a lot with this exhibition, who I just saw, Colin Spurlman. We said, hey, if you can do it with film, maybe you can do it with architecture. So we looked at other precedents. At the Centre Pompidou, for example, Morphosis had a large floor with a lot of little miniature models, or other examples, Renzo Piano, you saw that exhibition here in the city in New York a year ago, or another example of Richard Rogers in London. The point was that that couldn't have been what we wanted to do. We felt that much of the work had to do with perhaps a general questioning about what architecture is. Namely, amusingly enough, I'll show you an image. This is on the left is our office in Paris. On the right is the Centre Pompidou. We actually were right across the street from them. But seeing a big poster with your name in huge letter on this slightly mythical building was quite a challenge, especially considering that there was one particular characteristic to this space. It was a very, very large space, and it was also arriving at a moment when perhaps, how could I say? Imagine trying to have an exhibition about your own work. You have to have a distance. You have an overview. You're the one curating it. Rumors has it, by the way, that this book, Red is Not a Color, had a direct effect on Migarou, the chief curator at the Pompidou, for inviting us to have the show. Indeed, the book was really important because in a way it was doing the same thing in the form of a book, i.e. trying to take an overview, trying to take a distance, and trying to understand what the hell one is doing. Because, you know, we architects do not necessarily have a career plan. We do a certain amount of things according to circumstances, to encounters, to a competition you win, to the place you are. In other words, it's as you're doing it that you can start being your own editor. But in a way, in order to become your own editor, you have to have done a few things before. You don't become your editor right away. So the book, Red is Not a Color, was in a sense trying to discover what was the underlying discussion that was taking place within, or which was in a way the leitmotif within the work. The word concept had been used by me for so many years that I never thought that it was a key word, and indeed it was. So the project became really trying to understand why the idea of concept, why the idea of idea was actually so central to what architecture is, as opposed to form, as opposed to function, as opposed to style, as opposed to technology, as opposed to sustainability these days. It was really saying that perhaps before anything happens, there is something which has to happen in architecture, which is a concept or an idea. There's a particularity to that type of concept. It's not the concept of a mathematician. It's not the concept of a musician. It's not the concept of a philosopher. It's a concept that has a materiality. At one moment, you refer to something that is built, whether you build it or not. That materiality is what architects do as they translate concept into. So the early work, and that was in a sense crucial, perhaps at a period, I'll come back to that in a few minutes, the fact that it was a particularly interesting period. We're talking about the post-68 era, when I would say I belong to a generation that asked a lot of questions, that didn't have many answers, but certainly knew how to ask questions. The questions, of course, were what is movement? What is the role of other disciplines or other fields? In other words, is there a correlation between architecture and film? I just mentioned Kubrick. Is there any relationship between performance, movement, the movement of bodies in spaces, the way spaces are used? I remember us at the AA saying, it's not only the space, but also what happens in it. Namely, starting to discuss issues without using the word architecture at all. The word space was much more convenient because it could take you could take with you a large dimension of artwork, artists, but also writers, musicians, and so on. So in many ways, this questioning of the movements of bodies in space brought me, it's not the only reason, but in a way brought me to New York, and where it was a time just after the end, let's put it this way, the conceptual era was, conceptual artists was still very much alive, but at the same time, something quite important was taking place, was a series of artists continuing to raise the same question as the concept artist had been raised. In other words, something quite against the commercialization of artwork and the complicity of museums in that, tried to do certain pieces that were completely outside that mercantile system. In other words, performances, here on the screen you see Trisha Brown, but the most important thing about this piece is the fact that she's there not in a white space, not in the perfect white space of the museum, but she uses the circumstances, the condition in which she is, you could call it the context, in order to develop a piece. In other words, the protagonists of a piece are just as much the staircases, the fire stairs, the water towers, the chimneys, and so on. That's what is really the work. In other words, it's not an isolated object, it's not an iconic object, no. It is really a dialogue. It's quite an interesting way to discover that there is quite a difference between a building being used for X or for Y or for Z. I'll come back to that, but you can see simply on that doctored image of the Casa del Faccio by Terrani, that it's not quite the same whether you have the crowd or you don't have. And this relationship between the action and the space, of course, was something that had nothing to do with functionalism, nothing to do with use. It had to do with what happens in it. And indeed, became a series of provocative or polemical ads. I used to do these ads. I'll come back to that when I get to the exhibition itself. Simply, these ads were really trying to ask those questions about space and events, about constraints as well. And that led to the Manhattan Transcript, and I'll go quickly because now I want to go through the exhibition itself. So the book was trying to retrace these different moments, including things as crucial at one moment as the Acropolis Museum building, or more recently other projects which started to ask again that question of the relationship between space and material, about materiality, even arriving at rather amusing things when your client is a giraffe or a rhino. So, back to exhibitions. Both these images are at the Centre Pompidou. One, I believe it's Richard Rogers, and the other one is Frank Gehry, currently exhibiting in that gallery at the occasion of his Louis Vuitton inauguration. The space is interesting for any architect or any artist who want to exhibit, is the fact that you have probably the largest space that is available for architecture exhibition anywhere, namely over 11,000 square feet. In other words, about 30 meters by 40 meters. A quite unusual challenge, considering that 3 of these walls are glass walls. In other words, they open toward the plaza, and only one of these walls is solid. So, of course, it's fascinating as an architect because you ask yourself first, yeah, how am I going to do that? Do I do it with objects, only models? But our models are generally small. We started to look at themes. And these, as you can, these themes could be the space and event, the Parc de La Villette, or the idea of program, or the idea of concept form, or things of this sort, which very much came from a series of books that we had done over the years. In the early days, we didn't have anybody to prepare archives or anything like that. So we thought, since it was so hard to find any drawings that we had, a project we had done in the past, we said, well, let's do books. And so it's faster to look at the dictionary, at that catalog of projects, rather than trying to go into drawers and to files. It was pre-computers at that time. So every one of those thick books, 600 pages or so, were every time trying to find a common denominator of the project which were within these pages. So one had to do with space and event, another one had to do with the juxtaposition of programs or incompatible programs, another had to do with the idea of context and concept. What is the relationship between concept and context? What is the relationship between content and context, and so on? And the last one was about form for the first time. I'll come back to that again as well. So we tried within that huge square or rectangle of the gallery at the Pompidou to organize these themes. Circles, labyrinths. I was then finishing the zoo, the Paris Zoo, which was, but I'll come back again, as you will see, which has a certain amount of aviaries. And I like really the idea of these aviaries, which are, they are cages, but not quite. They're transparent, but you don't know who is inside, who is outside. And so we thought, hey, maybe we can do this. We can very well organize our exhibition within, since we were opening the zoo exactly like 2 weeks before the opening of the exhibition, why don't we actually say, just like at the zoo, where a cage is just as much, or an aviary is as much for people as it is for animals. The whole zoo works on that notion of not differentiating between the habitat of one species versus the other. So we started to develop a series of enclosures. At first, they were being made of mesh, exactly like the aviaries. We tried to find also something which had to do with the fact that we had a lot of documents that we had to locate. But again, this will come back in a minute. You may remember the famous map of Guy Debord, of the situationist, of the so-called dérive. We looked at the various themes of the exhibition, the 5 themes, as a sort of derive, a sort of drift, so that people could move from one to the other, either in chronological order, or possibly, and we try really to make them in chronological order, but we knew some people would evade, would escape. And so we started to make those in different configuration with quite a number of alternatives in their location, in that space. We were quite interested in the fact that it was a good way to, how could I say, to take over the space, to control the space simply through objects. Of course, you may think of Le Parc de La Villette, which is made of a series of small red objects which allow you to control the space as opposed to walls or whatever. And then brought a certain level of rationality into it, took the themes that I mentioned, space and event, or context and concept, or form concept, mapped them in relationship to the media we use. That's the blue part, the blue ellipses. In other words, you as an architect, if you build something, you use a certain media. If you do a drawing, you use another media. If you talk, like I am tonight, I'm using again another media. If I write about something, I use one more. And if I make a film or an animation, it's every one of these media are quite different from one another. And that was important if we were to show how the work unfolded. And then the little pink rectangles are, of course, the various projects we were we wanted to show. And then we started to play like a matrix, overlapping the different criteria, and then try to put the matrix into space. And at first, with this series of objects, again, the aviaries. Later, we tried to find other names, but among us, we used the word cages. And then the tables. The tables were important because as we were organizing the exhibition, we found, I mentioned earlier on that we didn't have much of an archive system, but when you organize an exhibition, you open a lot of drawers that you haven't opened for 25 years, and you find a few amazing things. So we wanted to show them as almost as an entomologist would show precious remnants or whatever. We did it first with these thematic bands. We then had the intersection of the bands with the various pavilion. You can use them like that as well. And then we developed a whole language of caption. Caption were incredibly important because I do not think that architecture can exist without words. I will disagree. Some of my colleagues will disagree with me. It's very simple. Architecture has to do with its own vocabulary. The vocabulary is important as things called columns or pyramids or labyrinths. These are also metaphors that are used by our whole society, and these cannot be distinguished from the act of building itself. So words and architecture are forever married to one another, whatever some of my friends may say. So we looked at some of these concepts, tried layout. We did also a series of mock-ups in our office of those enclosures with mesh, and I won't go into the detail of the reaction of the curators when they came and say, you can't have mesh because you see the legs of people walking behind, or you see the back of a drawing behind the front of it, and so on. So we tested those, and eventually arrived at this particular image showing the transparency, but also this incredibly important red wall, which was, as I said, the only wall that was there on site. I mentioned that the tables didn't quite work as a linear thing, so we could not, and I have to say that was a nudge of the chief curator saying, as we were testing, say, why don't you do a point grid? And of course, we did. So each of the tables were quite important because they were these places where the archives were. And so here you can see the plan of the exhibition itself. A view from the outside. Now I'm going to take you quickly through so you have a visual image of it before I start to talk about the content of it. So in other words, you can see, I mentioned that we have big glass wall at the Centre Pompidou, so you could see from the street through layers of graffiti, you could see the exhibition itself. Probably while I think the exhibition was visited by just under 100,000 people, there must have been 1 million people who walked past. The caption had to be both in French and in English, and the way to ask the points in order to engage the viewer was clearly with the idea that it was to question the a priori, the cliches, the dictionary of received ideas that most viewers have about architecture. So the project becomes really a way to engage the viewer into the work. In other words, not only showing it, but literally forcing people to, not forcing them, they would do it themselves with very short text. By the way, you see here on the left wall the Manhattan Transcript, which were shown for the first time as one single, in one single place. The Manhattan Transcript, a piece of work that I did over a period of 4 or 5 years in the early days here in New York. Some of it is at MoMA now. Actually, all of it is in MoMA. And so these are some images of the installation with the enclosures. The enclosures are simply now made of hardboard because the union of I don't know how you call people who hang the work, would not want to do anything on canvas or on mesh. So we have the cheap boards, but it looked quite good. And here is the distribution of work within the exhibition, so allowing people really to move in a both guided and haphazard way. I would say the average duration of people in the exhibition was over an hour and a half. It was quite fascinating to see people look at, there were two films that were being shown, one very short, another one for 1 hour. Totally unexpected. I thought people would not spend time there, looked at the questions that were raised, and eventually became very much the whole purpose of the show. Namely, each of the parts of each of the project, each of the building, there were about 40 buildings that were shown, each of them were accompanied by a question. Can a functional program be interpreted so as to generate a lively interior public street filled with unprogrammed and unexpected events? That's probably the longest question. But this was simply in order to address the curiosity, the incredible curiosity that people have about architecture. And one should not underestimate that. One should not also underestimate, as architect, the importance of events in one's life, in the fact that, and that's how the exhibition started, is that nothing comes completely out of the blue. We are all part, I hate to use the word generation, but we are all part of certain circumstances. If you were born during Second World War, it's quite different than if you were born afterwards. If you are, you come of age during the 1960 event, it has clearly certain implications. And in this particular case, the first tables were showing either certain things that I found quite interesting in terms of the relationship with film and photography, or, of course, the books that were published at the time. Those of you old enough to remember when Italo Calvino published Invisible Cities, that was an incredible book for architects. Or Anatole Kopp, City and Town and Revolution, or other books by Castello, by Lefebvre. These were shaping an intellect, they were shaping a question about space and politics, space and society. And inevitably, this has a role in the work that came afterwards, without even going into the most spectacular part of insurrection and so on, but really something that meant that there was a clear connection between what happens in the world of ideas. Politics are, after all, the world of ideas. The world of ideas when it's good, the world of ideology when it's not so good. So hence you are interested in the writers who tend to question this. At the top left corner you see the manuscript of Derrida as he started to work upon my invitation to collaborate with Peter Eisenman on a garden for La Villette. and a variety of other texts which were there from, again, Bataille to Barthes, to Roussel, to many others, that could, in a way, act as companion to architecture, and then leading to certain important pieces of work which at the time would have been called paper architecture. So hence this start, and I've been quite long at going over these preliminaries, seem to be important in order to indeed activate the interest of the viewer. And so then the exhibition would start with that big red wall with the Manhattan Transcript, which, for those of you who do not know, are not a little bit like a B-movie script. It's a form of notation. The subtitle of the exhibition was Concept and Notation. In other words, way to how to draw as an architect, how to draw things which are not quite architecture. In other words, not simply having the role of the axonometric or the slab or the columns, but perhaps questioning it in different ways, saying that there's no architecture without movement. You have to find, if I don't, in a plan or in a section, or in an axonometric, I do not draw movement, so I'm interested in finding out how to notate, to find mode of notation for movement, and of course, also what happens in it. Look at here, St. Patrick, and what happens. So the exhibition, the transcript were really introducing the viewer at this idea that one could perhaps notate, find mode of notation for things that are normally excluded from the architectural discourse. The layout of the long drawing, there's one of the drawings which is 32 foot long, was reminiscence of the first time it was exhibited at Artist Space. Artist Space was then on Hudson Street, and there I think I might have been one of the first or the first person in this era to have an exhibition in an art gallery. Architectural gallery had another agenda at the time. Back again, you understand the issue of movement and spaces, and of course the image of Trisha Brown dancing on the walls were quite, on the roofs was quite important. So a number of those documents, those early notations, from some self-generated to some that you could find in dance, in theater, in sports, were really shown in order to explain the genesis of the transcript themselves and, of course, the future work. It's not the place here, we wouldn't have the time to discuss in detail the various episodes of the transcripts, but suffice to say that it was a way to make movement and event absolutely undistinguishable in a way from architecture itself. How can we explain these type of things to a larger audience? So it occurred to me that I could potentially do ads, advertisement for architecture. These were amusingly enough published for the first time in an issue of Oppositions and on an article about transgression. And this image showing the decay of the Villa Savoie was as an important part of its effect, in a way. I wanted in the exhibition to show how the advertisement came about. Look at this. This is what we found. The freshest thing about this bread is something his diet had for centuries. Now look at the handwriting above it. It says, the most architecture thing about this building is the state of decay in which it is. And look at this sentence. So every one of the ad is actually built up on the rhetoric of advertising, including, actually you could have done it a lot bigger like that, yes. And then inevitably describing how these were made into postcards and published in a number of magazines. I would not write an article without the magazine publishing one or several of these ads. And of course, this one, which, yes. So could architecture, could a project begin with fiction as its programs? And of course, after trying with a number of texts from from Borges or from Edgar Allan Poe and Calvino, of course, we tried to do something a little harder, in other words, James Joyce. At that time, I decided to do it myself with my students and started with first establishing a grid, a point grid, and using the point grid as a way to anchor the discussion and the discourse, and developing a project which would indeed be not a transposition, but a sort of re-questioning ideas about language in an architectural manner, in the same way as James Joyce had asked certain questions in a literary manner. In other words, simply not trying to transpose, not trying to imitate, but simply saying that in other fields there are certain questions which perhaps come with the 20th century, which perhaps are of interest for the architects. I'll leave that. A little work where everything is drawn by hand. They are right on slides. Right on slides, you don't do that with a computer anymore, but here you would write, you would draw your drawing. It's about 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch. You project it, and you can have an instant lecture. So that was the early drawings. James Joyce Garden, I always presented because in so many ways, it is one of the features of the Parc de La Villette, the system of points. And then, of course, if one wants to look at film, the idea of film is something that, as I mentioned earlier, cannot be separated from architecture simply because of the fact that the movements of bodies in space, the space itself in a film, is one of the protagonists of the action. Or the actors. Much work, the screenplays, I'll go very quickly over that, except to say that it was interesting. I didn't discover it myself. It was when the curators came to the office and started to look at stuff. They suddenly saw a strange drawing, which was this, which sort of looked like a screenplay that was trying to become a house. And of course, something that I had carefully erased from my own memory, there were these drawings. In other words, something called the sequential house, which was not built, but basically a direct translation this time of this work on the idea of sequence. And this sequence, whether they were being, how can I say, continuous or discontinuous, in this case, discontinuous experiment in 3 dimensions, the transcript are simply notation in 2 dimensions, were a test of doing strange type of construction. Look at this. This was both in New York City, we're talking about 1978, one in Castle Clinton, and the other one on Hammersmith Plaza. It was, at the time, artists were quite interested in doing what they called installation context, site installation or site-specific sculptures. I was not terribly interested in the idea of becoming a sculptor, but quite interested in trying to test some of the ideas that had been drawn on paper and turn them into construction. So with a very low budget, I think the budget was always between $1,500 and $5,000, including demolition, which was the most difficult part of it. These were attempts to really take over a piece of territory. My friend Alan Tannenbaum took that picture. I'd also forgotten about it. And to simply show that a certain level, I would say these little site-specific installations were almost like an ancestor of what is happening today at PS1, the fantastically successful program at PS1, reserved for architects, except this was not institutional, it was completely improvised, and it was not meant for an architect. So let me get back to the exhibition. I won't go too long on the Parc de La Villette, it's well known. I will just show you one drawing which I find important. Of course, in the show there are a lot of those early mode of notations trying to express the idea of movement in space and how it translates eventually in a real building. I want to show simply this drawing because it's a natural drawing submitted for the competition. Now, those of you who are architects know that if you were to present this type of drawing in an exhibition, in a competition, you'd be immediately excluded. You wouldn't have fulfilled the requirements of so-called hyper-realist images. Try to tell me which one are the trees. They're not green, right? The buildings are red. Who would do a red building? It was another era. And an era where it was possible for a jury or a group of citizens to decide on a project amongst 400 or 500 competitors without having to be held by the hand and shown what it looks like. People maybe could think a little, but we can discuss that later if needed. So the general project becomes indeed, but I don't want to get onto that. Back to the exhibition. So we just saw the first theme, space and event. Now the second theme was program and juxtaposition. The idea of program is really important in architecture. Again, if this room is being used as an auditorium, it's quite different as if you use it as a place for worship or as a bowling alley. So in the same way as, and that was, there were those short film or animated, I called them the silent lecture at the exhibition, where you would ask people, what is it? Is it a church? Is it a sports gymnasium or a voting booth? Or is this person cooking in the kitchen, or are they cooking in the woods? What is the correlation? Or playing hockey in your living room? Or, of course, which one is the car park and which one is the museum? Or even this, one of my favorite buildings in New York City, you all know it, it's 22nd and 6th. Used to be a nightclub. Well, it was a church to start with, but before my time, I don't know what it could have been used for anything else. But when I arrived in New York, it was one of the most exciting. The Limelight was a great club. It became then a place where they stored used furniture, and then it became shortly a pizzeria. Then a fashion discount store, and now I understand it's a gym. Namely, there is no direct correlation between function and form. Who told you form follows function? They were not quite right. So we get to, of course, the idea of organizing those functions. Those functions can be organized, or those usage can be organized on a on just like musician draw music on partitions. This was the starting point of a whole series of experiments of trying to find another way to conceptualize a piece of architecture that eventually would, of course, look like a regular plan. Of course, they would look like a regular model, but the process was very different and was making your approach quite a different one. So the principle of juxtaposition, of a superimposition of incompatible functions led to some provocative examples, like having a running track intersecting a public library that didn't work quite well with the jury. I was kicked out right then. However, when we did a competition for a very large airport, the Kansai airport, by the way, I'll open just a parenthesis. It is interesting, there's a generational discussion. It was possible at the time for a generation who were barely in their late 30s, early 40s, to be invited to participate in huge competition. In this case, it was Kansai Airport in Osaka, when one had actually an office that had only 5 people. Today, I think it's very difficult for it to happen. And that's maybe an unfortunate thing, especially in that particular case. We rewrote the program. We said your program is missing a great opportunity to turn this long, 3 kilometers long airport in a linear city, and turn it really into a place that would be active 24 hours a day with offices, museums, shopping centers, hotels, etc., etc. It's 1988. Everything that an airport has become now, but at the time it was not. The jury this time did not kick us out, gave us a second prize and a fair amount of money, so maybe we were on the right track. So arrives another opportunity. La Villette is under construction by then. It's a building which has received its construction, its demolition permit. And I'm, at the time, it's interesting I mentioned the word envelope. I'll get to this just in 30 seconds. The building was to be demolished, but inside there were quite extraordinary spaces. The roof were quite incredible. And I thought, hey, what about wrapping it around, keeping the building? And not that I was particularly interested in historic preservation, but I thought the building was of definite historical, or simply it was a reasonably good building, and I wanted to keep it. So built an envelope around it that would then become literally a sort of, how could I, it would allow the possibility of something which was unplanned, in other words, between the outer envelope and the interior envelope, to have exactly this place of events that I had been discussing in the case of La Villette, but this time on a much larger building in 3 dimensions. So as you can see on this image on the screen, the envelope, and I think that's probably one of the very first time, it's 91, that the word envelope is used in architecture. The outer envelope is there to protect the inner envelope, in other words, the existing building, but also to provide a found space, a space that can be appropriated by the artist. By the way, the building is a sort of art cultural center, and turning it into not as a composition, but much more as a conceptual strategy, the fact of simply superimposing the 2 systems, the one that existed, the old, and the new that you added, creates something that not only established a dialogue, but established a potential for takeover and events. So simultaneously, as you can see from this image, and this is what was interesting with the Pompidou show, was the fact that there was the possibility of diverging from the main story. And one of the things that interested the, I don't know if I would have brought it myself, but interested the chief curator, Miguel, he was saying, Bernard, your importance, did he say, I'm using his words, because of certain relationships that were established between architecture and literary theory, for example, or philosophy, that was in the very early work, but also by having us starting what we did at Columbia in 1993-94, starting the so-called Paperless Studio. Now, so we showed at the exhibition interviews of Greg Lynn, Hani Rashid, Bill McDonald, and a few others, showing something that for me had very little to do with technology, but everything to do with notation. In other words, just as I said that you don't think in the same manner if you use film or if you use writing or if you use little scribbles, you don't think exactly in the same way when you use a computer. And so that was the investigation of that particular mode of notation, which is quite important, possibly in a way which really needs to be questioned today when we all architects use the same softwares and therefore talk the same, speak the same, and think the same. So back to the exhibition and getting to the third theme. Now, envelopes seem to be an important subject matter, and so we decided to investigate it further with the idea of vectors, the idea of movement. By the way, envelopes are a fairly recent invention, as you probably know. The Renaissance invents, in a way, the facade, something which is separate, which is applied from the structure itself. Le Corbusier continues absolutely using the similar proportional system, when in reality the architecture as envelope might have been probably something much closer to the reality of the environments and of enclosure and shelter. So the questioning of taking away these received ideas, this dictionary of received ideas and cliches of the vertical facade, the horizontal or pitched roof, and the cornice in between, we tried to work in a slightly different manner, adding the vectors in between, because there is no architecture without an enclosure and a way to get in or out. So sometimes those vectors are on their own. I won't talk too much about this drawing, but this building, a walkway in the west of France. The first envelope project was, or the second if we count Le Fresnois, the one I just showed before. Here we have the idea that if you have to do, that was a television, video and music festival, needed a particular building to shelter people from the rain. We decided to make it, as opposed to what other people would do, and instead of making as a private enclosed environment, we made it as a very transparent, public one. I always maintained that it was the real glass house, because if you take the glass out, the vertical walls or plates and the horizontal beams are all made of glass. If you take the glass out, you don't have anything left, as opposed to Mies or Johnson's glass houses. What was most interesting about it was the fact that once the temporary construction had been built, it was kept by the city of Groningen, part of their art program, and turned it into a place where they would have events. 25, we are going to celebrate the 25th anniversary of this. It is still there. It was meant to be there for 2 months. So in other words, the idea of what is an enclosure and how its meaning is derived by what happens in it has nothing to do with style. It has to do with how you organize and how you, in a way, stage circumstances. Other projects followed, much bigger. Interestingly enough, the bigger a building is, the more the envelope becomes important. The most expensive part of the building is often enclosure, it's wrapping. And here at a 6,000, 7,000 seat concert hall in Rouen in France, where the double envelope is here, you see it as an X-ray. The double envelope is really what allows you to stage what happens in the building. In other words, the outer envelope was made of steel, the inner envelope was made of concrete, and in between, of course, were the crowds moving in and out. Even the transparent seats were there to make that clear point that it is people who activate the space and it's not the architecture itself. When we were asked to do another of those buildings in the middle of a beautiful forest, we said, let's not do steel and concrete, let's test one thing. And now this is really important. We took the same concept, exactly the same concept, and said, let's now try to use different materials. In other words, polycarbonate on the outside, wood on the inside. In other words, acting not anymore on the level of concept, not anymore on the level of content, but possibly, or percept, but possibly on the level of affect. Those two buildings look very, very different, whether they are made of wood or whether they are made of steel. And hence, something else was an interesting lesson about what is architecture. Here again, a view from the inside. Projects developed, always exploring, every time asking a question. Here, ill-fated attempt to design a museum for African art. Beautiful project, I believe, but site circumstances, ownership, and real estate made it impossible to complete. But other projects come about. And here in this particular case, very, very briefly, a watch factory near Geneva, where my question was, how can we have the factory workers and their bosses, the directors, be under the same roof? In other words, continuing the discussion on the envelope. By the way, these sketches are always for most projects, not all of them, but practically all projects, I will always try to find very, very quickly through a very quick, I don't like the word sketch, I prefer the word notation, but even for, I call them small drawings, to have that power of that particular envelope can have in becoming a common denominator. And here the interior, the outer envelope is made of steel, the interior envelope is made of wood, the two are just collapsed onto one another, and a third material is brought in, which is glass for all circulation. In other words, limiting the number of material, that was a table at the show with the real material, limiting the number of materials in order to come as close as possible to the concept itself. We're building the second half of this building now, or the second building of it, using the same type of strategy. Now I'll come to the fourth and the fifth part very briefly. First, context, concept, and content. The three are interrelated. I'll just make you a little game. Which one is Bilbao? Which one is Los Angeles? Tell me. Well, in any case. Here is this, which one is La Tourette, sorry, this way, which one is the Boston City Hall, or which one is the Villa Rotonda, or a villa in Chiswick. Duchamp, exactly 100 years ago in 1914, had understood that very well, as he placed a battle rack or a bicycle wheel or a urinal in museums. In other words, it is the conditions that makes it so. But can you, in a way, if you have a context, can you conceptualize it? And that was the challenge for the museum, the Acropolis Museum in Athens, where the context was incredibly complex, namely excavations, the Parthenon, the most admired building in the history of civilization and of architecture. How do you feel when you're building 300 feet or 300 meters away from it? So the concept was really trying to work with this layering of three different logic: the logic of the excavation, the logic of the temple, and of course what was in the museum itself. Movement through the building and so on. Eventually, the building becomes exactly the conceptualization of the context in which it takes place. It's not based on a series of a priori ideas of what the modern movement is or what imitation of circumstances. It's something that is directly, in this particular case, a conceptualization of the context. Amusingly enough, yeah, I'll show you something. If I have that image, but I don't. The famous frieze of the Parthenon reminded me so much of the Manhattan Transcript, 32 feet. No, here it is, right? That's the Manhattan Transcript, and that's the frieze. In other words, the idea that the ancient Greek had understood 2,500 years ago, that you don't have to look at artwork as a still painting. That's what the British Museum has completely wrong. They show the Elgin marble, as I think they still call them, as a canvas, as a big tableau, when in reality they were meant to be looked at as a route, as a travel. And that's what we try to do with the Acropolis Museum. Also playing on the idea of fragmentation and so on. We were blessed with the fact that we were entirely responsible of the layout of the artwork and not having to play whatever with stage design. I'll leave that project apart just for the interest of time. I'd like us to have an opportunity to discuss with Tony. I want to mention one thing because it's very recent. We always work, when we do projects, we always look at all the possible permutations, all the possible approaches. In other words, we have never an a priori idea. We just test different ways to do it, and then we select the one which is either the best or the least bad. And but amusingly enough, I did a competition the other day that we lost. The jury complained that during the first meeting, we met 3 times with the jury. During the first meeting, I showed the jury different configurations that the building could have. They thought that I was trying to lick the whatever in order to appear as really nice to them. In reality, no. I think every architect never starts or never start with an a priori idea, but on the contrary, test what works best or works least bad. So this now other project I'll go now to the final part, form concept. You may have noticed that I don't believe I've used the word form a single time during this talk. No, had we used it in the office, trying always to get away from this very hot potato. And until the day we realized that there are certain programs which are so complex and so complicated that you cannot avoid using a form. In other words, design an area of a city, you're stuck. There is no logic in designing a city. So in this particular case, we started to develop what we called a concept form. It's a form which, in a way, generates a concept, or a concept that generates a form. You will recognize a lot of these. They are throughout the history of architecture, and they happen whether they are in so-called regional and whatever. So in many ways, some of our project then developed in this manner, trying to find like the notion of landscape. Landscape is artificial. Don't believe those who say that it's in nature. Nature is everywhere. You invent landscape. A lot of Lefebvre talked about the fact that the landscape of Tuscany is nothing but the projection of society on the ground. So I'll leave that project. I just want to show you one we just inaugurated a few weeks ago of a concert hall. The concert hall is entirely made of wood. It's a rectangle. It's a shoebox under a dome. The dome is made of steel. In between, it's concrete, again, playing with the conceptualization of material. And with simply a very simple geometry. By the way, spheres are never simple geometries. And then having the in-between space, the space that the audience or students, it's part of the college, can take over. And I'll just show you some of the images. The wood, by the way, interestingly enough, is OSB. It's a sort of compressed wood. It's very cheap wood, but it's very heavy and has incredibly powerful, very good acoustical characteristic, while being probably the cheapest wood that you can use, the wood that's used to do construction work. And here are some of the views. Briefly, also in the principle of the concept form, Alesia, the museum at the location of a famous battle between the Romans and the Gauls, taking the route that any museum where you start and you come out at the same place, but at the same time using that circularity to echoes the circle of hills where the various military troops were placed and so on. Interestingly enough, here again, two buildings that echoes one another. One is a museum, one is a center of interpretation. The center of interpretation is made of wood, the other one is made of stone. Here is some of the images of how the second envelope acts as a sort of, not only as a filter, it filters the light, but also as a way to absorb the light in order not to make that building too much of an imposition on quite a beautiful landscape. Inside, again, a route, again, only one material, concrete for the inside. In other words, that restriction of trying to stay as clear in one's conceptualization. And then finally, the Paris Zoo. Paris Zoo is always an unusual, interesting thing. Who is inside? Who is outside? Are you in? The giraffe is inside, or you are? You know. So that was the theme of the project, and the project itself became an exercise in using only three materials: the mesh, because you always need meshes. The glass for tropical greenhouses, and wood to protect the animals from themselves, in a sense. quite an extraordinary photograph from Ewan Barn showing the zoo from above. It's much smaller than the Bronx Zoo. It's probably a third of the size. The theme of the aviaries is taken again for the entrance, where the public enters an aviary, and then as you get to the places where the animals are located, whether you are going to a restaurant or to a shop, it's always using the same vocabulary. In other words, continuing with the same themes as I used in Alesia with the very large wood beams, but this time in a complete disorder. If I talked about concept form early on, here it was trying to talk about the concept inform or the informal formal. And two of the other images, once again using that rigorous desire to take architecture where it matters the most, in other words, in between what I would call a concept and a material. Thank you.